Okay, our nation is moving towards two societies, one white, one black, separate and unequal. This is part of the Kerner Report in 1968, which is a response to the riots that we've already talked about. And this just gives us a sense of kind of the move towards the end of the civil rights movement. Here we have Kerner, who was the special appointed by Johnson to lead this investigation. He said, segregation and poverty have created in the racial ghetto a separate society, that it was on the verge of becoming two nations, one black, one poor, and the other white and rich. It is a good time to make good the promises of American democracy for all races and for all people, rich and poor. And basically, he then went on to recommend that the report said that the only way to deal with this, blame the division on, basically said we had two separate societies, and blame this division on institutional racism, and said the only way to undo this is to have a long-term program that's greater and larger than Johnson's Great Society to reverse this trend. Johnson was actually somewhat insulted by this, but he knew that they needed to do this. Now tell them how great my Great Society is going to be. By basically saying that his Great Society wasn't enough, Johnson did feel like that was a slight on him. Severe critique of American society, institutional racism, that only a long-term national commitment could reverse the trend. It should say greater than great. But the Great Society never really got off the ground because of that bitch of a war, as Johnson put it, in Vietnam. The United States was spending so much money on Vietnam that $1 million a day at one point, and just pouring so much money in there that the money for his Great Society programs, the programs that were a set of reform programs for the protection of the environment, to make all people equal, and for the poor. There was an extension of job programs and environmental programs, education programs, loans, government grants, to improve and allow more people to access education, and this to redo the housing, to redo a lot of the government housing, to create low-income housing in places, to create a minimum wage nationwide, and to put some things in place that would benefit the poor. So, MLK in Chicago, as he now believed that the ghetto was a system of internal colonialism, that blacks were just as oppressed by low-wage jobs, inadequate housing, and inferior schools by racist laws. King basically saw the North ended. His program in Chicago, unfortunately, ended with a weak agreement on housing, an SEL program that boycotted businesses with few, if any, black workers. We spent some time on this Chicago approach, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but it basically showed that the racism and the division and the frustration of African Americans reaching this economic ceiling and being in poor neighborhoods and not sharing the riches that America was going through at this time was very frustrating, and possibly is what created this violence. And that's what the report said. And so MLK sees this. Unfortunately, his approach, his direct action, was not very effective because the Chicago police kept the peace, and this basically ended the effort for the movement in the North, and really just showed that the civil rights movement never really made changes in large cities outside of the South. James Meredith in his journey, James Meredith decided that he was going to set out on a 220-mile march from Memphis to Jackson. He was basically doing this as a march for freedom. James Meredith began this journey armed with a Bible, a plastic helmet, and walking stick. He was shot after 10 miles. This is him on the side of the road. He was shot full of buckshot by an unemployed white who was living in Memphis at the time. Civil rights leaders gathered around Meredith's hospital bed and decided to finish his march. They felt like if he didn't finish his march, he wasn't able to, but if they didn't finish his march, they'd be giving in to violence. So SNCC, CORE, and SCLC basically get together, and this will be the last time these civil rights groups get together to do a march. After this, there really is only a few people that march. Carmichael, who is the head of SNCC, rejected King's approach. The Negro is going to take what he deserves from the white man. He did not believe that direct action. He felt like King cringingly was deferential to whites, was putting the African Americans in a deferential position to whites, basically under whites. And he came back from jail and got up and talked about the Negro is going to take what he deserves from the white man. And he no longer is going to go to jail. He is not going to face or go to jail anymore. And he basically, on this march at night, calls for black power. That becomes his call. And the whole crowd shouts black power. King is kind of disillusioned by this and actually leaves the march at that point because there is a sense of loss. The march ends in violence. Louisiana police attack the marchers, similar to Bloody Sunday, and threw tear gas and fired into the crowd and beat the marchers. But because of this call for black power, because of this more militant approach, that the police, there was a lot less public outcry for the marchers because of this call for black power, which seems to alienate white society. Now, there was one good thing that came from the march. They registered over 4,000 blacks to vote during that time, and through Mississippi, that was a major accomplishment. Here's Stokely Carmichael talking to a crowd about the importance of black power. The call for black power. Define black America after 1967. Government programs did not materially uplift blacks, and it seemed far less important to them than a group identity and a need for independence. And that becomes kind of the main contribution of black power, is this idea of a group identity, to disassociate with the United States and kind of follow Malcolm X's call to unbrainwash themselves. Many blacks adopted symbols of their African heritage. There was a growth of an Afrocentric perspective in schools, colleges, and society in general. And so this call for black power becomes a rallying cry to begin to build, to rebuild and to build a black identity. The black power call is resonates with a lot of the urban blacks. Dramatic display of racial pride at the Mexico City Olympics in 1968. This is a famous photograph of these two athletes using the Olympic stage and their gold and silver medals to make a political statement with their hands uplifted. They were disciplined by the Olympic Committee, but were trying to make a statement of themselves, and that although, and this was during the playing of the national anthem, you can notice that both their heads are bowed as a way of saying that they don't feel respected by their nation, that they just won medals for, and did this display as a kind of protest. Black Power attempts to bring revolution. Former SNCC leader insisted white churches pay $500 million. James Farmer, former SNCC leader, insisted white churches pay $500 million in reparations for the way that whites treated them. The reparations would permit blacks to own land, run publishing companies, and receive specialized education, and even establish a labor strike fund. He spoke out about blacks being a nation that should aim to break away from the U.S. H. Rap Brown can be seen here. and he was calling for violence. He threatened to assassinate the First Lady, condemned Israel's conquest of Palestine, which actually really hurt SNCC because a lot of their supporters were Jewish, and by saying that Israel should not have taken over Palestine kind of alienated a lot of the Jewish groups, and incited a crowd in Cambridge, Maryland to burn this town down. However, most of these approaches to violence, to the way things were being done, were repelled and easily dispersed. Black Panthers for self-defense. The Black Panthers, created by Huey Newton, and were created in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale from in Oakland, California. The Black Panthers were kind of the most visible of these kind of more groups that were more upended or were more violent. The Black Panthers had a sense of that they would use violence if needed. They were probably less violent than what was being called for before, but in the video. But founded in October 1966, they patrolled neighborhoods because they were trying to respond to the racist capitalist police state that is the United States. That might sound a lot like communists because both Bobby Seale and Huey Newton definitely identified with communist ideals. They carried loaded Remington rifles and wore black commando garb while patrolling neighborhood for police misconduct. While doing this, they created popular operations such as community schools and provided free shoes, legal clinics, ambulance services, breakfast for the community youth, medical tests, and trips to visit imprisoned relatives. And so this type of public service definitely endeared the Black Panthers to the black community. But they only had a few thousand members in 20 cities throughout the United States. And so we're not seeing a group that has a ton of influence. But Edgar Hoover from the FBI kind of from the beginning was against the African American movement. He was against the civil rights movement. He wanted to remove King. He took photos of King where he was breaking his or having affairs. And sent those photos to King's wife. He did everything he could to try and remove King from the leadership of the civil rights movement. Even told people of the Klan where King might be. Basically abusing his power of the FBI to try and really go after people within the civil rights movement. The Panthers became a target. He called them the greatest threat to internal security. But I'm not sure how a couple thousand people could be the greatest threat to internal security. So the claim was given as justification for how the FBI worked against the civil rights movement. They arrested over 750 Panthers and killed 28 members of the Black Panthers, and basically really eroded the power of the Panthers. One of the things that Black Power did, though, was that many of the black leaders of the NAA, Randolph, Wilkins of the NAAC, Rustin, people from the Corps, all spoke about the danger of Black Power. That Black Power can only alienate whites, can only alienate some blacks, and King said that blacks only compromise 10% of the population. Nonviolence is the only way. That there is no way 10% of the population can overthrow the rest in a violent movement. King saw racism, and so King then moves more towards the left, the political left, more towards not quite a communist viewpoint, but moving in that direction as more of socialist, seeing that the government needed to help the poor. He saw racism and poverty basically as two branches of the same problem. White America exploited blacks to maximize profits. He argued against Vietnam as basically because of the economic issue. He felt the United States should not be spending $500,000 a day or to kill an enemy soldier. They were basically spending $500,000 for every enemy soldier killed, and they were only spending $35 a year to help a poor person in America. And he felt like that was unjust, that call was unjust. But his stand against the Vietnam War was not a popular one, and really kind of alienated the president because Johnson took the Vietnam War personally. His last campaign was in Memphis, and this was to support black sanitation workers in protesting how they were treated. They were paid less than whites. Only black workers were sent home if there was bad weather or they didn't need workers. They were given the worst jobs in unsanitary conditions. And so basically the blacks were being treated as second-class citizens, but at doing the same job as whites, but being paid less. And so they basically were done or wanted to really protest this. King led a large demonstration where violence erupted because some young blacks, not invited, attacked the police. 60 blacks were injured when the police fired into the demonstrators, and one was actually killed. And this is basically, they then negotiated, and the police were actually going to then protect King on another march, and they were trying to come to an agreement. But before that happened, as you see here, this is moments before Martin Luther King was shot at the Lorraine Motel by James Earl Ray, who was trying to collect a $50,000 award. King's assassination on April 4th, 1968. His death sparked a rash of violence that spread through over 100 cities that led to 46 killed, 35 injured, and 40,000 arrested. And you could say there's a sense of irony here for a man who followed Gandhi, for a man who talked about nonviolent direct action, that his life then sparked riots, I think would be saddening to him. Congress passed a weak civil rights bill in 1968. The bill did make it illegal to make decisions on renting or buying homes based on race. So you could no longer use discrimination as a reason not to sell your home or to rent to someone. It made it illegal to use violence to intimidate people. You could no longer bully or intimidate or use violence to keep people from exercising their civil rights. So this is finally that kind of against all the massive resistance, the Ku Klux Klan actions, really made this stronger bill against that and made it a federal crime, a felony. After his death, the movement waned, but his death was only a part of the reason. The movement to black nationalism and the lack of clear goals meant there were very few gains after 1968. There was still court cases about schools, and things continued to develop. But basically, in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan, he took away many of the programs and really kind of weakened the Civil Rights Commission. He neutralized the EEOC, the employment group. He restored tax exemptions for segregated private schools, challenged court-ordered school busing, and proposed diluting the Voting Rights Act, which is quite amazing. Reaganomics, or his economic program, contributed to a black poverty rate of 34%, a rate that was triple of that of whites. And basically, his kind of movement against the civil rights kind of put African Americans in a tough spot. So we will kind of look at the effects of the overall civil rights movement at school and kind of see how successful it was over time.